Hello everyone. Recently, I overheard a debate between two of my friends about whether pixelated graphics should still be used in video games. One argued that they were state-of-the-art back in the arcade era, but their time had passed and game developers should move on to more modern art styles. The other argued that pixelated art styles can still look very nice when done correctly, and, in turn, enhance their respective video game. I found this conversation pretty interesting because it made me think about the different reasons that pixel art is used for. If you've seen some of my past stuff, and that's not even to mention my frigging name, then you've probably already guessed that I'm pro pixel art. I also suspect that the majority of people share my stance on pixel art, but despite that, I still thought it would be interesting to review some practical applications of using it, even in the modern era of technology. So, let's talk about why pixel art is awesome. The first and most obvious reason game developers use pixel graphics is because they're generally less work and take less expertise to create. This makes them especially frequent in indie games, which usually only have one developer in charge of art, writing, and programming. So yes, they take less work and less time, but isn't this indicative of a lower quality product? I'll expand upon the artistic appeal of pixel art later on, but the answer is yes. A style that's limited to pixel art sometimes requires sacrificing appeal for efficiency. However, this ignores the fact that not every game necessarily wants to look nice. Many game devs simply want the ability to experiment around with an idea they had, and pixel art provides an accessible entry point for doing so. It's important to remember that images that aren't pixel art are still stored as an array of pixels. The pixels are usually just smaller and a bit blurred, which is why you don't notice them. That is, however, until the image is upscaled, at which point the pixelation becomes more noticeable. This can be a big problem, and it usually requires each texture to be stored at a relatively high resolution and being downscaled by default. That way, even when it's upscaled, it's still only displayed at a fraction of its real size. As you might guess, doing this requires additional space on the disk, as well as requiring more work from both the artist and the programmer. Pixel graphics avoid this problem because of their very nature. Seeing more pixelation when they're upscaled doesn't matter, since being pixelated is the whole point. By being designed to look good while using as little detail as possible, pixel graphics are able to be stored at very small resolutions with no adverse effects on their quality. There is, however, one weakness of pixel graphics that I feel needs to be mentioned. Pixel graphics are only able to be cleanly upscaled by using whole number factors. If you upscale it by a non-whole fraction, it'll end up looking warped with the pixels having uneven dimensions. This can be solved by using interpolation, which will blur the borders between colors to preserve the proportions, but it also makes it a lot less pixely. The reason non-pixel images avoid these problems is because they're not designed to have clean borders in the first place. Now we arrive at what I'd consider the most compelling argument in favor of pixel art. There are many times when the game's designer thinks the aesthetic works well within their game. In the debate I mentioned earlier, my friend who is pro pixel art brought up the art style of Celeste, which I think is a good example. To borrow a term from Solar Sands, Celeste adheres to a maximalist minimalism sort of art style, where each asset itself is kept rather simplistic in design, but each scene is composed of a plethora of assets and animations that make it feel a lot more full. Celeste also makes use of these pixel shader effects that wouldn't look as nice if the game wasn't as confined to a grid. Another somewhat relevant example of this is the Undertale and Deltarune franchise. At first glance, most people would assume that its pixelated style is a result of the relatively small team that developed both games. However, Toby Fox has said that he would likely have gone for this aesthetic regardless of how large the team behind the game was, saying that there's many gags that pixel art simply works better with. And this is still ignoring games that purposely go for a retro aesthetic. Many games use pixel art, as well as the occasional inclusion of retro UI and sound effects, to invoke nostalgia in their player base. Shovel Knight is an example that comes to mind as a game that tries to emulate as many artifacts from the arcade era as possible, using both pixel-based sprites and typefaces. Unlike the previous examples, which use pixel art with the intention of enhancing their visual appeal, there are some games that purposely aim for true minimalism. One reason this is effective is because it allows each player to fill in the missing details however they want to. Minimalism is also sometimes used to divert the focus away from the artwork to instead call attention to another facet of the game's design. It's worth noting, however, that minimalist art styles aren't at all confined to pixelation. You can easily create minimalistic representations of objects with as many curves as you like. It's just that pixel art is a pretty common medium for minimalist art styles, and therefore, I thought it was important to at least mention it. So, there's my defense of pixel art. Although it's no longer necessary in video game creation, that doesn't mean it's not still useful. There are many reasons, both practical and artistic, to keep using pixel art not only in video games, but also in other artistic mediums. You don't have to agree that it looks good or works well within a certain video game, but you can hopefully at least acknowledge the appeal of the art style to both creators and players alike.